With many challenges facing Africa, what role is Standard Chartered Bank playing? Diana Layfield, CEO of the Africa region for Standard Chartered Bank, spoke to me at the World Economic Forum on Africa about where the bank is investing on the continent.
Well, obviously, with a footprint across the continent, infrastructure is a huge part of our business as we support both African businesses expanding and African sovereigns in their raising money and infrastructure building across the continent. There are obviously, as you know, a number of key areas of infrastructure deficit, pretty much across the board. For us, one of the most important is the energy or power deficit. In some ways, that lies at the heart of galvanizing both jobs around manufacturing itself, and also productivity across the continent. So for us, it's a hugely exciting time because we're starting to see real change in the last couple of years in terms of power supply across the continent. You're probably aware of some of the larger deals we've been doing recently, supporting the Azura power plant in Nigeria and a number of others across the continent, from geothermal and solar all the way through to coal and gas-fired stations. So I think it's a broad spectrum initiative. We're also the largest participant, as you know, private sector participant in Power Africa, Obama's initiative to create substantial access to electricity to huge swathes of the population in the continent. I think we went back and more than doubled our commitment from 2 billion to 5 billion at the summit last year, and I'm pleased to say that we're already a substantial way through committing that 5 billion to the continent. So power is a key area. Transportation is another key area. Yeah. We've obviously leased 10 A320s for South African Airlines, helping them create a more efficient balance sheet and fund their fleet. And I think we are looking at a number of further port expansions across the continent. The most recent has been the Matola coal terminal port in Mozambique. Mm-hmm. So whatever area of infrastructure you look at, it's something that we see as hugely important for the continent in building both its job capacity and its longer-term economic capabilities.
Diana, for Standard Chartered to be such a big player on the African continent, you have been here for many, many years, and you are one of the most significant private sector players. Your working relationship with government, especially given the fact that Africa is made up of 54 states, the regulatory environment is uncertain. Why is Standard Chartered an African optimist?
I think all of the fundamentals in Africa continue to be good. Clearly, we're in a challenging couple of years for a number of countries, given the fall in the oil price and given some of the global macroeconomic trends. But if you look at the things that lie at the heart of what makes Africa a great story for the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, those fundamentals have remained robust throughout. The population. Young demographics, small number of people in the aging population, that's a terrific platform on which to build for the future. The second is the consumer potential within Africa. Yeah. And the great difference, as you know, in the last decade compared to previous decades is that the proportion of growth that's accounted for by commodities has gone from 75% down to 25%. So it is a consumption-fueled growth now. That gives much greater domestic resilience to African economies. And also, I think governance is constantly improving in Africa. There are clearly huge areas where that needs to be improved. There are areas around legal and regulatory frameworks which still need work. But it's been consistent progress. And I have to say, I do think the recent election in Nigeria is a terrific example of strong democratic transition where the outcome of an election isn't necessarily what people predict, but accurately reflects the will of the people. So I think whatever dimension you look at it from, the fundamentals that are in place are very, very strong. Doesn't mean there aren't challenges, doesn't mean there aren't things we need to fix, but I think it's a terrific story for the future.
The opportunities are there quite clearly. How does this, just what you've mentioned, actually motivate your decision regarding expanding even further on your African footprint or geographic footprint, especially on emerging markets and frontier markets in Africa?
I think that the challenge for us isn't where we would want to be, because you can create a good story for almost all countries on the continent. It's about how you allocate finite amounts of investment. So the challenge for us is it somewhere new, or is it building a stronger business in Nigeria, or in Kenya, in Ghana? Mm-hmm. And I think for us there are a number of key geographies in which Nigeria is probably the most significant, where we really believe we have to invest for the future. And if that means that we have to delay plans to go into other markets, I think that's something that we're comfortable with. We already have a substantial physical presence in 15 sub-Saharan markets, which if you look at those 15, they in themselves account for 85% 25% of sub-Saharan African GDP. So for us, it's not a question of investing into Africa. It's how you make those decisions between existing and new markets.
You're also not someone who's scared or taken aback by some of the threats on the African continent, like the outbreak of Ebola that we saw. Now, you were brave enough to take a trip to Sierra Leone. What was that like, especially given the fact that you were literally in the front line of being potentially infected with Ebola, but the reasons for your visit and what was the trip like?
The reason for going was really twofold. The first was to show our staff and our clients that we were there for them, that the bank was supportive of them even in a very difficult time. And the second was actually to show the government and the business community internationally that this was still a place that you could and should go to and invest in. And I think, for me, it was a very humbling visit. Our own team have done such a tremendous job through such incredibly difficult circumstances. Our clients, when I met them, their individual stories are remarkable. Our telecom client who started up the call center to answer all of the Ebola emergency calls.
Wow.
The concrete producers who are helping with emergency construction. So I think it was a remarkable time to go. And I think people have it's a great example of people overcoming enormous challenge, but frankly also needing more external support than they've necessarily had. And so I think it's incumbent on us and other businesses to continue to support Sierra Leone, to support our teams there, and to make it clear that there's opportunity even in difficult circumstances.
Goes back down to human connection quite clearly. The significant lessons that this has taught you that you are managing to relay to some of your staff members and peers across the globe?
I think the first is there are always things you can do. And so it's been different at different points through the crisis, but early on, the biggest challenge was actually communication around disease transmission. One of the reasons it spread so quickly was people not understanding what it was. So we sat down with our staff and said, what's the best way to reach people in this kind of environment? And we came up with the idea of a radio soap, so a drama which wasn't about Ebola, but which had key Ebola messages and episodes built into it. It's called Uskaindindis, and that has now 3 million listeners in Sierra Leone as a radio drama, which, as you know, is a huge proportion of the adult population. But that was a very strong vehicle for helping the government and helping the NGOs communicate messages in a way that is enormously compelling. Now, that isn't a classic banking activity, but you have to think about what you can do to help. We've done some more key banking things. As you know, with CDC, we put together a $50 million facility to help SMEs in Sierra Leone who are working together with the Ebola efforts to help with reconstruction in the economy. So it's moved from protection of our staff, thinking about the wider environment and the population, to thinking about the whole economy and reconstruction, and how we now work with the government on energy, on infrastructure, and on helping them rebuild the country.